Hamburg, Germany, December 1944. The air reeked of smoke and sewage. Frost clung to the broken window panes of a half-collapsed apartment building. In a cramped second-floor room lit only by a flickering candle stub, 4 people sat around a single pot, an enamel kettle blackened by years of soot. Inside, bubbling faintly in a shallow layer of grayish water, was one shriveled potato, half rotten, barely enough to split among them. The father, skin drawn tight over his cheekbones, used a spoon to carve the softest part for his youngest child. His wife silently added a pinch of salt the last they had. No one spoke. They just listened to the distant howl of sirens and the not-so-distant thump of American bombers overhead. Another night, another raid, another miracle if they made it till morning. 2 weeks earlier, Franz Becker had stood in this same room, an Obergefreiter in the Wehrmacht. He had been home on a rare furlough after 3 years in North Africa and Normandy. His uniform hung off him like it belonged to a scarecrow. He had dropped nearly 25 pounds since street low. There had been no meat in the house, no heat, and barely any bread. His mother cried when she saw him, not because of his wounds, but because she had nothing to feed her son. Now, Franz was 5,000 miles away on the other side of the war. Camp Huntsville, Texas. Morning reveille blared from a loudspeaker as the winter sun rose over neat rows of barracks. It was 7:15 a.m. Franz shuffled forward in the breakfast line with 2 other POWs, metal trays in hand, still groggy from a night on straw mattresses. The line moved fast. The kitchen was efficient. Inside, American soldiers in clean uniforms dished out steaming portions onto trays: scrambled eggs, oatmeal, jam, and to Franz's astonishment, a thick slice of white bread. Soft, warm, fresh. He froze. The soldier looked up, confused. "You want bread or not?" Franz blinked. Yes, please." He sat on a wooden bench, staring at the plate. The eggs, he understood. The oatmeal, too. But the bread, that was something else entirely. He took it in his hands. It was soft, still warm. Not sour, not hard, not moldy. He took a bite. It nearly melted in his mouth. For a moment he didn't taste it. He only thought of Hamburg, of that one blackened potato, of his sister's thin arms, reaching for half a spoonful. And now this. White bread. For him. A prisoner. He asked the kitchen orderly later that morning, thinking perhaps this was a mistake. Perhaps it was Christmas. "Is this only for today?" The man laughed. "Nah, you'll get it again tomorrow. It's standard issue." Standard issue. To prisoners, enemy combatants, men who had fired on Americans just months ago. Franz had seen American rations in France, chocolate bars, canned ham, cigarettes. He had assumed they were exaggerated, isolated, for propaganda. But now, it was in his hands, and it was real. That afternoon, he saw the supply truck back into the camp's storage facility. 2 men unloaded crates, stamped with the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps seal. Franz could read the labels. Wheat flour, enriched, 50 pounds, dozens of sacks, just for bread, just for this camp, just for men like him. He did the math. This camp alone housed over 3,000 German prisoners. Each one received bread daily. That meant nearly 10,000 slices a day. At that scale, the white bread wasn't a luxury. It was infrastructure, a machine that produced softness and warmth even for those who had tried to destroy it. Franz thought about the supply lines, the ships, the trains, the wheat fields in Kansas, the steel ovens baking thousands of loaves a day, all to ensure that even enemy soldiers thousands of miles from home would eat bread softer than anything he had ever received on the front. That night, back in the barracks, someone passed around a Red Cross newspaper clipping showing a photo of a bombed-out German bakery in Dresden. No ovens, no flour, no bread, only ruins. One of the men said bitterly, "We fight like wolves, and they feed us like tourists." Franz didn't respond. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, hand resting on his stomach, still full. He began to wonder not just how he had lost the war, but what kind of country could afford to feed its prisoners better than his homeland fed its children. The bread had been warm, yes, but its message was cold, efficient, ruthless in its abundance. Franz Becker, soldier of the Reich, for the first time, began to fear not just the guns of America, but its factories, its fields, and its ability to make even mercy industrial. And in that slice of white bread, he tasted defeat. The next morning, it happened again. Same line, same trays, same white bread. This time, Franz didn't freeze. He accepted it like the others, nodded his thanks, and walked to the table. But inside, a knot tightened in his chest. It wasn't hunger. It was something stranger, something colder, a sense of being outproduced. He had grown up under a Reich that promised efficiency, order, and greatness through strength. At military academy, he'd been told American culture was weak, soft from jazz, indulgent from capitalism, undisciplined from democracy. Yet here he sat, eating better as a prisoner of war than he ever had as a soldier of the Reich. And not because he had earned it, or deserved it. No, because the American system didn't even need to care. It simply could. Franz asked one of the guards later that week, a young corporal from Iowa, how many camps like this existed. The guard shrugged. Stateside? Over 500, I think. Maybe more. This one's medium-sized. Franz did the math in his head again. 500 camps, average of 3,000 POWs each. That meant nearly 1.5 million enemy soldiers being housed, clothed, guarded, and fed 3 meals a day. That's over 4.5 million meals daily. Bread, meat, vegetables, sugar, for men who had tried to kill them. In Germany, back in '43, his own platoon had received ration cards for boiled turnips. He remembered once scraping mold off black bread with his bayonet. He remembered another night in a dugout near Kursk, sharing a can of sardines between 5 men. He remembered how they used to joke, "We don't need bullets, we need calories." But here, in Texas, he watched leftovers being scraped into barrels, perfectly edible food tossed for pigs. He saw trash bins filled with bread crusts and meat bones. It wasn't just feeding. It was wasteful abundance, a kind of victory that didn't march in boots, but sat quietly behind kitchen doors. Franz was assigned to kitchen duty the following week. It was there he saw the scale. The walk-in refrigerator behind the mess hall was bigger than most bunkers he'd fought in. Shelves stacked with butter tins, crates of oranges, blocks of cheese packed in wax. There were bags of sugar so large he couldn't lift one alone. Giant steel vats simmered constantly, producing soups in quantities he'd only seen in military planning documents. The chef, a civilian named Harold, ran the operation like a machine. "Don't skimp," he told them. "Regulations say they get 3,200 calories a day. We deliver 3,200. You leave a man hungry, and it's me who answers to the Red Cross." The Red Cross. Franz blinked. "You mean, they check?" Harold chuckled. "Buddy, they measure the food. We've had inspectors come through here with weighing scales. They count eggs. It's all logged." Franz felt dizzy. In the Reich, inspections were about punishments. In America, they were about consistency. One afternoon, he overheard Harold talking with a supply officer. "We got 3 boxcars of flour arriving Friday, should hold us another month." Franz stepped outside and looked toward the railway spur that fed the camp. It ran straight to the main Southern Pacific line. The Americans were shipping trainloads of flour across a continent just to feed their enemies. That night, as he lay in his bunk, Franz whispered to himself, "They're not fighting a war. They're manufacturing one." He began asking himself questions he had been trained never to ask. What kind of country builds enough bakeries to feed its soldiers and its prisoners? What kind of economy moves food not by the sack, but by the ton across oceans? What kind of military counts calories not just for pilots and tank crews, but for the men it is captured. The next morning, breakfast included 2 slices of white bread and a boiled egg. Franz didn't speak while he ate. He just looked around. At the bread. At the Americans. At the scale of it all. He remembered the winter of 1942 on the Eastern Front. Frozen corpses of German soldiers curled beside dead horses. Men had died with biscuits in their pockets too hard to bite, too few to share. Supply lines had collapsed under snow and partisans. The cold had claimed more lives than bullets. Now, in Texas, he was gaining weight. He wrote a letter to his mother that week. He was careful, knowing every word would be read by censors. "We are fed well here," he wrote. "Better than I have ever known in uniform. I worry for you, Mama. You must not think of me suffering. If anything, I fear that I have never known what peace looks like until now." He didn't include the part about the white bread. He couldn't. How would she understand? 3 days later, he received a Red Cross parcel from Switzerland. Inside was chocolate, canned milk, and a rare treat, a half loaf of dense German rye. He broke off a piece, offered some to Harold in the kitchen. Harold bit it, chewed slowly, then winced. "Hard stuff. You guys eat this?" Franz smiled faintly. "We used to." In that moment, he realized something chilling. Even their memories of food were becoming foreign. He began keeping a journal secretly, hidden in the sleeve lining of his coat. The first entry was simple. The 27th of December, 1944. The Americans do not need to convince us they have won. They only need to keep feeding us. By New Year's, Franz had a new understanding of power, not the kind that marched in parades or dropped bombs, but the kind that quietly fed 1,000,000 mouths without hesitation. And in that quiet, in the bread, in the measured calories and leftover butter, he found something more terrifying than any tank. A country so abundant, it could be merciful. He had been trained to believe mercy was weakness. Now he saw it was a byproduct of overwhelming strength. And with every soft slice of bread, Franz Becker tasted a deeper kind of defeat. January 1945. Franz Becker, once a lean Panzer Grenadier, stood in front of the infirmary scale at Camp Huntsville. The needle ticked up. 154 pounds. He had gained 12 pounds in 6 weeks. The camp medic, an older man with glasses and a southern drawl, chuckled as he marked the weight on Franz's medical sheet. "You boys eat better than some folks back home." Franz didn't laugh. He couldn't. The truth lodged in his throat like a bone. Back home, in Hamburg, his mother had once written, "We've eaten boiled wallpaper paste. There was flour in it, I think. Maybe." Now, in captivity, he was not only fed, he was nourished. 3 meals a day, fresh produce on Tuesdays and Fridays, 2 cups of milk daily, sugar rations, the occasional orange. Once a week, roast beef with gravy. On Sundays, dessert. He wasn't alone. Across the barracks, men who had arrived skeletal from months of combat or starvation were filling out. Some grew bellies. Jokes surfaced about pounds and Camp Huntsville diet plans. Laughter came easier now, but beneath the jokes lay a strange guilt, a dissonance they could not articulate. They were prisoners of war. They had killed American soldiers. And yet, they were getting fat. Franz wasn't religious, but he started thinking in biblical terms. In Exodus, the Egyptians fed their slaves to keep them working. Here, the Americans fed them for no reason other than the fact that they could. That realization haunted him. One night, after roll call, he sat outside the barracks with Klaus, a former U-boat engineer who had surrendered off the coast of North Africa. They sipped watery coffee, staring at the moon over Texas. Klaus said, "Do you remember when food used to be strategy?" Franz nodded. He remembered vividly. In the Ardennes, his platoon commander once refused to light a fire because it might alert enemy patrols. The men ate frozen sausage raw. In Sicily, they had opened tins of expired beef stew with bayonets. On the Eastern Front, They had watched supply convoys vanish in snowdrifts, never to return. Food was not just scarce, it was a weapon, controlled, hoarded, starved into meaning. Now, food was constant, predictable, merciless in its regularity. Klaus added, "This country, it doesn't just produce, it overproduces. Look at us. We're not soldiers anymore. We're—" He searched for the word, recipients. Franz didn't respond. The word recipients sat heavily in the air. Later that week, the camp received a visit from a Red Cross inspector. Clean-shaven, fluent in German, the man walked through the kitchens, measured portion sizes, reviewed logs, interviewed prisoners privately. When asked how often they received bread, Franz answered honestly, every day, usually white, occasionally rye, never spoiled. When asked if he had ever gone hungry, he replied, "Only when I chose not to eat." The inspector smiled, jotted notes. "You are lucky," he said. "Most POWs in Europe are not so fortunate." Franz lowered his eyes. He knew what he meant. Reports filtered through the grapevine. Soviet prisoners in German camps starving by the thousands, British POWs in Italian camps surviving on moldy pasta, American soldiers in Stalag Luft camps chewing on boots. Here, in Texas, men complained if the soup was thin. The contrast wasn't just shocking, it was morally destabilizing. What kind of war was this, where the defeated were treated like boarders in a dormitory, where the victors cooked for the vanquished, and the kitchens ran on industrial-grade logistics? Franz found an answer buried not in philosophy, but in numbers. One of the American guards, a college student in civilian life, lent him a Time magazine issue from November 1944. In it, an article titled "Victory by the Pound" laid out production statistics. Franz read it obsessively. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps baked 14 million pounds of bread per day. In 1944 alone, the U.S. produced 250 million pounds of dehydrated eggs. More than 1 billion pounds of canned meat were shipped to both fronts. 200 million rations were stockpiled enough to feed a population the size of France for a year. It didn't seem possible, but it was true. Another article stated, "The American soldier may go to war hungry for battle, but never hungry for food." Franz felt a kind of shame reading that, not because the Americans were boasting, but because he realized how unprepared the Reich had been. Germany had built tanks and rockets, but couldn't keep a single infantryman fed in the snow. He had once believed in blitzkrieg, but now he saw the longer war, the one America had been quietly preparing for, not in speeches, but in calories. Later, he found another number, one that chilled him. In 1943, German troops on the Eastern Front received an average of 1,850 calories per day. American prisoners of war, held in U.S. camps, received 3,200 calories. The enemy ate more than the frontline soldier of the Reich. That number changed him. It rewrote everything. Because if the Americans could afford to feed their enemies more than Germany could feed its champions, then the war was not just militarily lost, it had been economically unwinnable from the beginning. That night, Franz added a line to his secret journal. "We thought they beat us with bombs. But it was bread. Bombs break bones. Bread breaks belief." Some of the other prisoners laughed when he said it out loud in the barracks. But they weren't laughing the next month, when more letters arrived from home. His friend Otto, a machine gunner from the 352nd Division, received a postcard from Leipzig. His sister wrote, "We traded Mother's wedding ring for butter. 1 stick." Another, Heinrich, was told his father died of pneumonia because the hospital had no heat and no soap. Franz stopped reading his own mail. Every letter was a window into a world that no longer made sense. He had lived in scarcity so long he mistook it for strength. Now, he saw, America hadn't won because of superiority in will or morality. It had won by removing scarcity from the equation. By early February, the barracks had a nickname for the kitchen, the Arsenal of Appetite. The joke carried a truth. Because in this strange new world of captivity, every slice of bread, every spoonful of sugar, every pound gained by a German POW was another silent message. We don't need to hate you, we just need to outproduce you. And they had. They fed him until he believed it. It was a sound Franz came to recognize, the low rumble of diesel engines at 4:30 a.m. when the supply truck from the quartermaster depot rolled in through the west gate twice a week. Always on time. As precise as artillery. He had begun volunteering for early kitchen duty not because he liked the work, but because he wanted to see it again. To witness, with his own eyes, what he once thought impossible. A logistical system so vast, so relentless, it had no concept of lack. The truck doors swung open. Inside, towers of flour sacks, neatly stacked cans of peaches, crates of eggs nestled in straw, barrels of molasses, and boxes labeled Army butter, pasteurized, not for resale. He touched one. Cold, solid, marked with the date, packed 3 weeks ago in Chicago. Now, here, in Texas, being offloaded for men who 6 months ago were firing Panzerfausts at American tanks in Normandy. Franz glanced at the manifest sheet on the clipboard. The truck carried supplies for just 2 days, for one camp. 1,200 pounds of potatoes, 600 dozen eggs, 400 loaves of bread, 40 gallons of milk, 20 gallons of vinegar, 150 pounds of beef. 2 days. The scale hurt his brain. He had once seen a divisional headquarters struggle to find enough sausages for a Christmas meal on the front. The officers had rationed brandy by the spoon. Here, they were feeding prisoners with enough excess to stock a luxury hotel. He asked Harold, the kitchen supervisor, how much butter the camp used per month. Harold didn't even blink. About 8,000 pounds, give or take. Depends on the season. Franz's hands went still. That was more than 4 metric tons of butter for a prison camp. Back in Hamburg, his mother had written, "We melted pork fat to make fake butter. It turned gray in the cold, but we pretended." He stopped pretending. America didn't pretend. America delivered. Later that week, while peeling potatoes, Franz struck up a conversation with a logistics sergeant named Tom. The man had studied engineering at Purdue before being drafted. "You want to know the craziest part?" Tom said. "This is just the leftovers. The real supply lines, they go to Europe, to the front. What you guys get here, that's what we can spare." Franz swallowed. How is that possible?" Tom shrugged. "Because it's not just about war. It's about systems, scale, planning. You guys built rockets. We built refrigerated rail cars." Franz remembered something from Normandy. A Luftwaffe officer boasting about the V-2 rocket, how it traveled at supersonic speed, how it would change the war. It had taken Germany 3 years to develop. Each rocket cost the Reich over 100,000 Reichsmarks. The U.S. had spent that much every hour just feeding its troops in camps. In the mess hall, Franz noticed another detail: the consistency. Eggs always arrived on Tuesdays, oranges on Fridays, bread never ran out, milk never soured, meats were rotated by expiration dates. Nothing smelled spoiled. Nothing ever seemed missing. In the Wehrmacht, he had learned to improvise with missing. Here, he was learning to fear what it meant when nothing was missing. One day, he helped inventory the pantry. Beside rows of canned fruit were dozens of tins marked ham and lima beans. 1,944. The same tins were stacked in Red Cross parcels. He remembered hearing American GIs joke about it. Ham and lima, the enemy deserves it. Even their worst food was industrialized, standardized, and delivered with mechanical precision. Franz found a newspaper clipping from Stars and Stripes in the trash pile. It had a quote from General George C. Marshall. "An army runs on its stomach. A nation wins on its logistics." He folded the page, placed it into his coat pocket, and reread it that night in bed. It sounded simple, too simple, but it was true. Germany had built tanks it couldn't fuel, raised divisions it couldn't clothe, marched armies it couldn't resupply. America had built supply that could support an army and its enemies simultaneously, and then scale it up. In late January, a transport officer gave a talk in the yard. The prisoners were allowed to attend. He spoke in English, slowly, through a translator. He described how the United States had built over 2,700 Liberty ships since 1941, each capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. How 70,000 trucks had been shipped to France in just the 3 months after D-Day. How 9 million soldiers had been fed, clothed, armed, and rotated through active theaters of war. The numbers didn't sound real. They sounded like science fiction. But Franz had already learned. American fiction often became fact faster than anyone believed. That night, Franz added a new entry to his hidden journal. We worship strategy. They built distribution. We feared shortages. They engineered abundance. Our Reich was a fire. Their republic is a factory. He looked around the barracks. Men were no longer starving. They were growing. They played cards. They sang. One had even started sketching portraits in charcoal. These were not defeated men in rags. These were healthy, rested, well-fed captives who had been, in some twisted irony, rescued from their own empire. What kind of enemy does that? Franz knew what the answer had to be. Not one driven by hatred, not one driven even by revenge, but by volume. Industrialized, mathematical, remorseless volume. Later in February, a new batch of POWs arrived from France, men captured after the Battle of the Bulge. They were emaciated, frostbitten, some too weak to stand. When they were led into the mess hall and served trays of warm food, bread, ham, milk, several of them wept. One collapsed sobbing over a slice of banana pie. Franz watched in silence. He felt something crack deep inside. It wasn't grief. It was the unbearable knowledge that this, the warmth, the food, the surplus, had always been possible. But his country had chosen war machines over bakeries, rockets over railways, ideology over calories. And the war was not just being lost in the skies or in the cities, but here, on a tray, in white bread. March 1945. The war was still raging in Europe. Dresden had burned. Berlin was cracking. But inside the fences of Camp Huntsville, spring was already arriving. Birds nested in the pines lining the compound. The Texas wind warmed the barracks by day. The prisoners planted onions and cabbage in a small garden plot. Life moved unnaturally forward. But something else had changed, too. There was a silence now. Not from fear, not from fatigue, but from doubt. The conversations in the barracks no longer centered on the Führer's speeches or rumors of secret weapons or salvation through final offensives. Those voices, the loudest ones, had grown quiet. Franz noticed it most at night. Where once men had huddled around maps, pointing at radio updates, now they sat in silence, eating pie, drawing, playing chess. The war was becoming irrelevant, and no one wanted to admit it. Franz felt it first in the way he folded his laundry, in how carefully he cleaned his boots, not with military precision, but with something else, domestic care. He no longer cleaned them like a soldier preparing for inspection, but like a man maintaining order in a world that had lost its center. One morning during flag raising, a fellow prisoner, Otto, the same man who once declared, "America will rot under its own luxury," refused to stand. When the guards ordered him to rise, he didn't argue. He simply said, "I've already surrendered. No need to perform anymore." No one punished him. They let him sit. And that was worse. Because in the Reich, resistance was punished. In America, it was often ignored or tolerated, even fed. Franz began noticing others faltering too. Klaus, the engineer, who once corrected anyone who misquoted Goebbels, now spent his afternoons learning English from the camp priest. Heinz, a former SS corporal, burned his party badge in the furnace behind the kitchen. 2 Luftwaffe pilots requested Catholic confession. not for their crimes, but for their silence. The collapse was quiet, internal, a shifting of tectonic plates beneath the skin, and it terrified Franz. He remembered one night back in 1942 in a trench near Tobruk. His captain had said, "We are the spine of Europe. The last men who believe." That sentence had carried him through 3 years of war. He had repeated it under fire, with blood on his hands, when friends died screaming beside him. Now, sitting on a bench with a full stomach, that same sentence sounded hollow. Not wrong, just small. One day, a new poster appeared in the canteen. It showed the American war effort in numbers. 27,000 aircraft, produced in 1944 alone. 8,000 tanks shipped to Europe in 6 months. 300 pounds of food per soldier per month. 1 rifle for every 2.5 Americans in uniform. 85% of the world's aviation fuel refined in the USA. Franz stared at the numbers. Then he looked around the room, at the trays, the cutlery, the electric lights, the radio on the wall playing jazz. He asked himself a question he never imagined possible. Was I even fighting the right war? He remembered the speeches of purity, of destiny, of sacrifice, but none of those speeches had ever fed him. They had only demanded from him, bled him, starved him. But this machine, this system that fed both friend and foe with equal ruthlessness, this was something else entirely. It didn't ask for his soul, only his cooperation, his silence, his appetite. And it was winning. Franz began writing less in his journal, not because he had less to say, but because the words no longer made sense. How do you confess betrayal to an ideology that has already abandoned you? He tried to pray one night, not to God, but to memory. He prayed that his father, who died in Leningrad, would forgive him, that his mother, who was likely starving, would understand why her son was alive and gaining weight in Texas. He prayed for permission to let go of what he once believed, but no answer came. So he started helping in the library. Camp Huntsville had a small one built by the YMCA, stocked with donations, filled with English books, some translated into German. There, Franz read Steinbeck, then Twain, then Roosevelt speeches. He read about the Tennessee Valley Authority, how the U.S. government built entire hydroelectric networks just to power rural towns. He read about how Ford produced a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at Willow Run. He read about General Marshall's supply routes across 2 oceans, about how the U.S. had created more trucks than the rest of the world combined. He read, and he wept. Because while Germany had lectured him about ideology, America had printed manuals how to fix an engine, build a bridge, irrigate a field. And manuals work. He began to see the war differently, not as a clash of armies, but as a competition of civilizations. One shouted, the other shipped. One inspired loyalty through fear, the other through logistics. And he began to understand. America didn't win because it was good. It won because it was ready, because it knew what it took to feed 1 million men, and had built that system before the war even started. The Reich had built monuments. America had built warehouses. One day, while shelving books, he found a line that stayed with him. It was from a U.S. Army field manual. Victory belongs to the side with the last gallon of gas and the last loaf of bread. He folded the page, tucked it into his journal. It felt like prophecy. By late March, Franz no longer dreamed in gray. He dreamed in colors: red ketchup, green beans, white bread, blue uniforms, orange crates, yellow butter. His dreams weren't of tanks or battles, but of systems that moved food faster than bullets. He still missed home, still feared the war's end, but he no longer believed the Reich was eternal. He had seen the truth. It wasn't in speeches. It wasn't in songs. It was in the calorie count. It was early April when the letter arrived. Franz almost didn't open it. He had come to fear letters from Germany. Each one was a blade cutting deeper, sharper, slower than any shrapnel. But the envelope bore his mother's handwriting, familiar, Tight, faded, like it had been written under cold hands. He opened it in the corner of the library, behind a stack of military history books. He read slowly, his lips moving without sound. "My son, I have received your last letter. It gives me peace to know you are well. We are surviving. The soup lines are longer now. Ration cards buy very little. Your sister's shoes fell apart, and we cannot find replacements. She wraps her feet in rags. There is talk of another evacuation. The bakery was bombed last month. We trade salt for flour now, when we can. Yesterday, I saw a child faint in the street from hunger. But you must not worry about us. You must stay strong. You must not waste your food. Love, Mama." Franz didn't move for a long time. He stared at the paper, at the creases, at the smudge of ink where her tears had bled into the word flour. He wanted to scream, to tear the books from the shelves, to curse the war, the Reich, the gods, but he did nothing. Instead, he folded the letter into perfect corners, slid it behind the page from the U.S. Army manual he had saved weeks earlier. 2 papers, 2 worlds. One, a plea for salt. The other, a plan for mass bread distribution. That night, Franz walked into the kitchen and stared at the shelves. 20 tins of peaches, butter stacked in bricks, steel drums of corned beef, untouched. A crate of powdered milk marked Chicago, the 10th of March, 1945. He walked to the trash barrel. Inside, half-eaten biscuits, broken eggshells, bread crusts. Bread crusts. His mother had once boiled crusts into broth. He turned away. Back in the barracks, someone was whistling "Don't Fence Me In" from the American radio. Others were playing poker. The mood was light, too light, as if war were just a memory, a shadow outside the fences. But Franz couldn't pretend anymore. His faith hadn't just cracked, it had collapsed. He lay in bed that night and whispered, "We gave everything for a lie, and they fed us like humans." Because the truth was now clear. The Reich had asked for their blood, their bones, their belief, and in return, it had given them hunger. America, the enemy, had given them calories, blankets, books. The Reich had burned their cities. America had delivered their mail. The next morning, Franz did something unthinkable. He approached the camp priest, Father Matthews, and asked for English lessons, not for escape, not for survival, but because he no longer wanted to return home with only German in his mouth. The priest looked at him carefully, then nodded. Franz wrote a new line in his journal that evening. "They will say we were broken in battle, but it was bread that undid us. Bread, and letters from mothers who starved under flags we saluted." By mid-April, the rumors became official. Germany was collapsing. Allies had crossed the Rhine. Hitler was in a bunker. The radio broadcasts grew frantic, then fell silent. Some prisoners still clung to hope, but not Franz. He had let go in silence, let go of the speeches, the salute, the myth of German invincibility. He hadn't surrendered in battle. He had surrendered in the pantry. The day the American guards told them of Hitler's death, a strange stillness gripped the camp. No cheering, no weeping, just breathing. Franz watched as one of the former SS men tore a swastika armband in half, tossed it into the latrine. Another prisoner, a young corporal, muttered, "We survived him. He didn't survive us." But Franz didn't smile. He just looked down at his hands, thicker now, not from work, from nourishment. Hands that were supposed to build an empire, now soft from peeling potatoes. And for the first time, he didn't feel shame. He felt relief. That evening, he wrote his final journal entry. "I was a soldier. I followed orders. I believed. But no war doctrine prepared me for what the enemy would do with mercy. They fed us, measured our food, gave us books, let us write home. Not because we deserved it, but because they could. And that was the real power. We thought we fought a weak culture. But we were standing in the shadow of a factory that could feed the world. We brought fire. They brought bread. And the bread won. He closed the journal, sewed it into the lining of his coat. Outside, the camp lights flickered on as the sun fell behind the pines. A truck arrived, bringing more crates of oranges. Franz didn't even flinch. He just whispered, "Of course," because that's what America did. Even as it won, it kept feeding the men who tried to destroy it. And in doing so, it changed them forever. Summer 1945. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. The flags had changed. So had the maps. So had the truths. Inside Camp Huntsville, word spread fast. Repatriation was coming. They would be going home. Or so they were told. Franz sat under the shade of a pecan tree by the south fence, staring at a crate stamped Quaker Oats, Akron OH. He didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't pack. "Home," he whispered. But where was that now? Hamburg was rubble, his family scattered, maybe dead, the Reich gone, the uniform he once wore now a relic, folded in shame, locked in a footlocker with boots that no longer fit. That week, a U.S. officer visited the camp to process volunteers for repatriation. Most men lined up, but dozens quietly, without protest, did not. They weren't deserters. They weren't criminals. They were simply not ready. Franz was one of them. When his name was called, he remained seated in the library reading The Grapes of Wrath. The officer found him and asked why he hadn't reported. Franz looked up and said, "Because there's nothing to go back to." The officer frowned. "You're not the only one, but your government is asking for you." Franz smiled, bitterly. "I served their orders. I gave them years. They gave me hunger. And now they ask again?" The officer didn't argue. He just noted it down. Franz wasn't alone. Over 8,000 German POWs in American camps eventually refused immediate repatriation. Some applied to stay, others delayed. Many returned, then came back to America as immigrants, students, workers. But all of them shared one invisible wound. They had seen the other side, and it made more sense. One man, a Luftwaffe mechanic named Dieter, wrote in his camp memoir, "In Germany, we worshiped the machine for war. In America, they built machines for bread. The difference is subtle and total." For Franz, the turning point was not ideological. It was tactile, practical, human. The warmth of the library, the taste of sugar in the coffee, the fact that his captors let him speak, let him read, let him question. America didn't beat him with propaganda. It beat him with access, with infrastructure, with systems that ran so efficiently. They didn't need loyalty, only participation. By August, Franz was assigned to a low-security agricultural detail in Kansas. There, on a farm near Salina, he worked beside Japanese-American workers, some from internment camps, others free. He met a man named Kenji who had lost a brother in Europe fighting the Nazis. They picked tomatoes together, side by side. No guards, no fences, no commands. One evening, Franz asked, "How can you work next to me? I wore the uniform that killed your people." Kenji replied, "Because if we stay angry, we never get to rebuild, and I'm tired of ashes." Franz never forgot that sentence. In the fall of 1946, long after most POWs had gone home, Franz stood before a judge in a small courtroom in Texas. He asked for permission to stay. He offered no excuse, no plea, just honesty. "I saw how your country feeds people, not just prisoners, but everyone. I want to be part of a place that builds ovens for bread, not smoke." The judge granted him a work visa. Later, citizenship. Years later, Franz wrote in a letter to his sister who survived, barely, "I didn't come to America. I surrendered to it." In 1985, at the 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, a group of American veterans gathered for a dedication ceremony. They unveiled a plaque. Not to a general, not to a battle, to a mathematician, Abraham Wald. Franz was there, in a suit, American lapel pin, old but still standing straight. He touched the plaque. Read the words carved in bronze. To the mathematician who saw the unseen and saved the unreturned. An old pilot, now white-haired, stood beside him and said, "You served under the swastika?" Franz nodded. "And now?" Franz smiled. "Now I serve the idea that bread can defeat bullets." The pilot laughed. "Hell of a good idea." Franz Becker died in 2003 in Kansas at the age of 83. His obituary didn't mention the war. It mentioned books and bread and the fact that he had sponsored 3 Vietnamese refugee families in the 1,980 seconds because no one should starve in the name of a flag, he once said. He was buried with his journal, which the family never opened. But on his gravestone, beneath his name, one line was engraved at his request. He learned that logistics could liberate. Epilogue: the statistics left behind. Of the 378,000 German POWs held in America, over 5,000 never returned. Many became American citizens. Some became teachers, farmers, engineers. A 1,948 survey found that over 90% of German POWs held in the U.S. reported being treated better than expected. And yet, back home, an entire generation struggled to understand why their sons came back praising the enemy. Franz had answered that question many years earlier, because in their enemy's kitchen, they saw something stronger than nationalism. A system built not on fear, but on the ability to feed strangers.